Well, joining me now in New York is Diego Aria. He's a Venezuelan politician and a former representative to the UN. He was also with Juan Guaido and accompanied him at the Colombian border. Sir, thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Were you surprised that Guaido was not arrested upon his return?
No, I was not. I even made a statement saying that the regime would not dare to put his hands on top of him, would not dare to touch him because of the international repercussions and the fear that some countries might take some harsher actions.
Now that he's back, Guaido has called on his supporters to mobilize on Saturday because, as he said in a tweet, all the support we have and all the support we need will depend on whether we stay in the streets. He wants strikes. He wants people to paralyze the public sector. How can that be helpful when people are struggling to find food to eat, to paralyze the public sector? Isn't that going to lead to more suffering?
Well, the public sector is not producing anything. The public sector, on the contrary, is very heavy on the many people that are completely unneeded. And it is important that after returning to Venezuela, we continue the pressure on the regime. And the only pressure that you can have a civilian population that is not armed is actually stopping many of the regime's activities. The only way. And it will keep the pressure and the enthusiasm of people that for about 90% reject the Maduro regime.
As a supporter of Guaido and as somebody who's pushing for change, there's a belief from Maduro and his supporters that while people are suffering, you and Guaido and your allies and the United States and others are weaponizing the need for humanitarian change. You're weaponizing the idea of humanitarian aid as a guise for regime change. Address that for me, please, sir.
Well, that's absolutely absurd. To weaponize food, actually, the regime is doing that. The little food that there is in the country, they use it to provide to some of the people who they believe are their followers. No, a humanitarian assistance being called by the international community as a right action to take. The United Nations, the Food Program, the European Union, the United States, everybody. The only one who came up with that absurd idea of weaponizing food is the Maduro regime.
And the UN Secretary General Guterres has said that he wants all parties to conduct dialogue to end the political impasse. Of course, the cynic would say this is what the UN Secretary General would say, whether it's Guterres or Kofi Annan or Ban Ki-moon or whoever. But let me ask you, sincerely, would you sit down with Maduro and try to resolve this with dialogue?
You know, you were absolutely right. Any Secretary General, any diplomat are forced to use a sort of the decalogue. Negotiations, sit at the table, both parties must negotiate. You know, we have tried that in the last 3 or 4 years. Venezuelan politicians have attempted to sit at the table. But you know something? It is very difficult to sit down when there is no government on the other side. When there is a band of criminals, many of them linked to narco trafficking, and it is very difficult and actually unprecedented to sit down and speak to a regime that has morphed into a narco state. It is actually a very hard thing to do.
Was it a mistake in declaring Guaido president from your side?
According to our constitution, actually, when Guaido became the president of the National Assembly, he swore that he was going to fulfill his duties. So when he became automatically the president, when there was a void, a vacuum in the power, already he was sworn in to do that. Maybe he should have done it also, but he's not self-proclaimed. He was proclaimed by the Venezuelan constitution that automatically declared him president as soon as Maduro was out.
Maduro believes that the United States is behind a coup attempt using Guaido, using you and all the other Venezuelans who are anti-Maduro. Your response to that is what?
Well, the Maduro regime, as Chavez before, have been saying that for almost 20 years. They blame the United States on anything that happens in Venezuela, even though the United States is the only country that pays for the oil that Venezuela produces. That's not the case. You know, the countries, for example, the United States, have been trying to push him through sanctions. But it's not only the United States. Now, many of the countries of the European Union, many of the countries in Latin America are enforcing sanctions because they see Venezuela as a threat, not only to us, the Venezuelans, but a threat to regional stability.
Are you afraid that all of this might lead to civil war because both sides are doubling down?
No, really. I've seen civil wars, and it's not the case in Venezuela, where you only have one side is armed, fully armed, not only with the armed forces. Because remember, we don't have armed forces. The government of the regime, the Venezuelan regime, is a military regime, and the civilians are completely unarmed. So a civil war only takes place when both sides are armed. That's not the case in Venezuela.
And what do you make of the fact that while Guaido is calling for strikes and demonstrations, Maduro is calling for strikes or demonstrations to counter them as well, anti-imperialist demonstrations? Aren't we going to see trouble on the streets?
No, every time that the opposition lead protests in the streets, immediately the regime tries to do the same at the same hour, the same day. But there's no way they can actually counter that. When you have a rejection of almost 90% of the country that is against you, you'll find very little people. And actually, the few people who attended the regime's protests were public members of the public administration. They will start disappearing soon, and you will see how thin is the support that the narco regime of Maduro has today.
As an experienced diplomat, somebody who's supporting Guaido, yes, we see that the United States, many of the Europeans, the Colombians, the Brazilians, the Argentinians, they are supporting Guaido. But what's your message as a diplomat to those who are supporting President Maduro, to the countries such as Turkey, to the countries such as Russia? What's your message to them?
To see Russia has attempted to include Venezuela into a sort of a Cold War to confront the United States using the case of Venezuela. I think the Russians couldn't care less for us, for our welfare, whether we starve or not. They care to see if they can carve a niche in the Western Hemisphere to try to confront in one way or another the United States. China more moderate and more moderate in its attitude than Russia, but Russia really is really unforgivable what they have done. Actually, recently in the Security Council, it looked more a confrontation with the United States than a defense of the Venezuelan cause or the Maduro regime.
Diego Aria, thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Well, let's bring in two new guests now, joining us now from Toronto.